is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. In recent weeks, reports of wrongful detentions have sent shockwaves through Connecticut's immigrant communities and across the country. But activists say the best defense is knowledge. They're holding workshops and trainings to help immigrants and undocumented people in particular understand their rights and prepare for encounters with ICE, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. Latino communities reporter for Connecticut Public, Daniela Donzel, has been following these efforts closely. Danny, thank you so much for being with us today.
Of course, thank you so much for having me.
And for our listeners, let us know if you're worried about a run-in with ICE or have questions about where to turn to. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Danny, first off, can you tell us about the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE's recent presence in Connecticut? Has ICE detained people here?
Yeah, so there have been unconfirmed sightings from residents just across Connecticut of ICE in their hometowns. The immigrant community members that I've spoken with have said that they've seen ICE presence in their neighborhoods. In speaking with ICE, I've been able to confirm that enforcement agents have been in Connecticut. They've carried out detentions and in some cases deportations of charges and convictions of very serious crimes. So according to ICE officials, they are carrying out legal enforcement of detentions and deportations in the state.
And have you spoken to anyone across the state who has had firsthand experience engaging with ICE?
Yeah, I had the pleasure of getting to know an activist named Arlene Angel. She's incredible. So she's an activist with Make the Road Connecticut, who is a group that advocates for immigrants as well as other minority groups. And she unfortunately did have to flee her home about 2 decades ago because of ICE potentially coming to detain and deport her and her family.
And do you know how Arlene Angel ended up on ICE's radar in the first place?
Yeah, so Arlene lived in a home with other undocumented families in the city of Hartford. They all lived kind of on the same floor. And one of the people living with her actually ended up in a car accident. And in that situation, it ended up that ICE detained her. The woman was then arrested, put into detention, and she actually connected with someone else in that same facility. And that someone else ended up asking their daughter to go to the house where they lived because that woman wanted to warn her family as well as Adeline and the other people there that ICE had the home address and could be coming. And so that daughter did in fact go to the house, just knocked on the door. Adeline didn't know any of this at all. So when she came, it was a complete shock to Adeline that this was happening. And for her and her family, there was no question. They had to leave.
And so many things happening, of course, when this is in the moment. So I imagine it being extremely stressful. You have no idea what's going on. You know, as you're covering your stories and talking to advocates, have they shared what Arlene's experience highlights the need for preparedness? And what exactly does the preparedness look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much going on. There's a lot of fear and tension in the community right now. And even Arlene herself wanted to share her story because, you know, at the time she didn't know what to do. She didn't know where to go. She also had her 1-year-old daughter at the time. And so there was even fear that, like, if the worst had happened, what would happen to her daughter, right? So Arlene says that the best way to be prepared is to know your rights and most importantly to have what's called a family preparedness plan. So that is a packet that includes all types of information needed in an emergency. So that can be anything from, children's home schedules, their screen time, their lunches, allergies, for example, that kind of thing, emergency contacts for school, for, doctor, whatever. The key component of the packet is what's called a standby guardianship form. It's a legal form. All it does is it designates a new caregiver if the stated emergency, such as a deportation, were to happen. So that way the child is cared for.
Well, and sort of building on what you just shared with us here, talking about children and their families. Now, are parents and children, especially children who are still dependent on their care, uniquely vulnerable? And if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, that really depends, right? Because when it comes to immigration, everyone's case and status is very unique. And it gets even more complicated if you're in a mixed status family, right? So if you have undocumented parents with children who are U.S.-born citizens. So that level of vulnerability really depends on where you are in your immigration process and any legal issues you may have, either in court or any arrests, whatever. that's why a lot of the attorneys that I've spoken with who specialize in immigration, they tell me that it's important for families to get legal assistance. One, to know where they stand when it comes to their immigration status, but also to understand what directly impacts their specific situation. So when they hear things on the news, for example, they're not panicking because it may not apply to them. So knowing where you're at is very important.
Well, and a lot of these legal aid centers and professionals across the state, this is not new work for them. But certainly it's emphasized because there's so much awareness now or wanting to become more aware. Or as you mentioned earlier, there are a lot of tension and fear. So
Right.
people are calling them up.
Yeah.
And has their work changed since President Donald Trump promised mass deportations of immigrants, according to your report?
So from the people that I've spoken with, it doesn't seem like the work itself has changed, right? Kind of the bread and butter, if you will, of immigration is very much still the same. What has changed is just the sheer amount of work that's kind of like on their desk, if you will. So a lot of the calls that they're getting to these centers are from people who are seeking assistance, looking to ask about family preparedness plans, asking what kind of legal aid they need, for example, either it's for asylum or work visas, what have you. And so that the sheer amount of people just reaching out has definitely increased, especially in those first couple months when President Trump returned to office. But the people that I am speaking with, they said that they are keeping an eye on the White House just to, remain informed. It's very difficult. A lot of what comes out of the White House then gets sent into court to be challenged. So it's very difficult. So at least keeping an eye and being aware is kind of the key component here.
Well, and I know you mentioned earlier that families can or should start think about a preparedness plan and to really put those together. But I imagine that for some people, may not know where to start because it's very overwhelming. Are there any organizations or people in Connecticut that are helping families to do this?
Yeah, I mean, you don't know what you don't know, right?
Right.
So it's like the best way that you can get help is actually through these legal aid centers. So Greater Hartford Legal Aid and New Haven Legal Assistance, for example, have hosted workshops, sometimes with immigration attorneys, so that people can sit down with these attorneys and fill out this preparedness plan themselves, or even with just advocates that are with them. There's also advocacy groups like Make the Road to Connecticut that help families make these plans. But even the state of Connecticut actually has a template on their website. It's a packet that you can fill out on your own time at home. You can print it out, and that way you can have a copy for yourself, for the caregiver, for whoever needs it. And that's in English, Spanish, and other languages as well.
And so we will have all of these groups and organizations information available on ctpublic.org/wherewelive for those who might be interested in checking that out. And earlier we spoke about your source, Arlene Angel. How did her situation end up panning out? Was she able to get help, and how is she doing now?
Yeah, so Arlene and her family were able to leave. It was a stressful situation, but they found a new apartment. Arlene says when she spoke with her neighbors afterward, they had cited potential ICE officers near the home. So for her, that was just kind of confirmation that they had made the right call. Arlene then joined a local advocacy group in Hartford that has since disbanded, but they helped her connect with a lawyer so that she and her husband could get legal permanent residence in the state. So they are green card holders, and she and her husband are now in the process of getting their citizenship. But in the meantime, she is a fierce advocate for her community. I am constantly seeing her throughout Hartford just doing the good work that she does for her people. I love the way she says it, where she says, this is her way of giving back to the community that helped her.
Well, and I can imagine, too, that I think it can be very empowering to see someone like Arlene out there sharing her story and helping the people, helping the community. I also imagine that at the same time, that people could still be reticent in asking for help, fearing being out there in public. When it comes to confiding in others about your family's statuses, it requires a lot of trust, right? So, like in your reporting, what are you hearing from communities about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right now, a lot of people who are afraid, I've heard of cases where people are afraid to leave their homes. They don't want to get out where there's potential risk, so they kind of stick to their daily obligations, right? So work, school, and then home. And so that also kind of gets in the way of what they may need to feel protected. So that includes like in-person workshops, for example. If they're not afraid to leave their home, they're probably not going to these workshops. So a lot of these groups that offer workshops for family preparedness plan or what have you are often offering a virtual option as well, so people can do it that way. And also these groups, many of them are not sharing the details of where and when these workshops are happening, unless it's through their internal network. So they're not sharing it on social media, for example, just out of precaution and safety for the people that are wanting to be there.
Right. And what are you also hearing from other immigrant communities? Because the immigrant community is so large and very, very vast.
Yeah, I mean, as the Latino communities reporter, I tend to focus on Latinos, but, as part of the immigrant community, they're not the only ones that are out there. I've spoken with a member of the Asian American Pacific Islander community who says, they're also feeling this fear and tension in the group. And it's actually making folks in that community rethink things like celebrations of Lunar New Year, for example. So it's this kind of balance between we want to share this with everyone and want to have people come out versus is promoting this event going to put a target on our community and put people at risk? And so that makes things very difficult as well. Also down in the southern parts of Connecticut, I have had the pleasure of knowing an attorney from Stanford named Philip Burns. He speaks Haitian Creole, and he tells me that he is often giving lectures solely in Haitian Creole to cater for the Haitian community. So there's a lot of different communities that are being impacted by this as well. And so that fear and tension is kind of widespread.
So we've been going kind of broad in the broader sense of how can you get help or some of the things that you should think about in order to put together a plan. Mm-hmm. You've also reported that volunteers and activists across the state are working to help the immigrant community know their rights. So you mentioned Philip Burns just now. Mm-hmm. Who are some of the people and organizations behind this help?
Yeah, absolutely. So Philip Burns is an immigration attorney. He's worked closely with an organization called LEAD, Latinos for Educational Advocacy and Diversity. So that's one group that hosts a lot of events and workshops for immigrants in need of any kind of assistance that they're looking for. We're also talking about, Greater Hartford Legal Aid and New Haven Legal Assistance, which I mentioned in the past. They're great resources. But in terms of advocacy groups, besides Make the Road Connecticut, you also have the Samia Collective and New Haven Immigrants that are down in New Haven. You have IRIS, which is the Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services, Junta for Progressive Action, and Connecticut Students for a Dream. So these are all advocacy groups that really focus on helping the immigrant community.
And again, for our listeners, these will all be listed on our website, sctpublic.org/where we live. And so we've been talking about plans and trainings and workshops. And can you talk about other methods that these organizations are using to teach people their rights? Because my understanding is some of their approaches are actually rather unique.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So oftentimes what you'll see is kind of like a lecture style. So Philip Burns, he specializes in this. And the way he likes to do it is very plain as possible. So kind of walks through a potential encounter to kind of give you the firm steps of here's what you're probably going to want to do. Here's what you're actually going to want to do instead, and kind of does it in that fashion. In New Haven, I spoke with advocates who take a more interactive approach. So after their lecture, they actually do skits so that people can see what your rights look like at home, in your car, at work, or in a public space. And then they actually have the audience members stand up. So I was in the audience and I had to stand up with everybody, and you all line up with a partner and you kind of practice what these rights look like when you're actually interacting with a quote-unquote ICE officer. And they also are setting up something called Train the Trainer. So they're training people to give these workshops themselves. So they can do it at home. So for people who are afraid to leave their homes, can do it in the home and safety of a trusted neighbor or loved one.
Well, because you have been a part of these trainings, would you say that they've ramped up across the state? How are people feeling after the training?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of these organizations were actually planning these trainings even before the election was called. So, they were ready to kind of hit the ground running once once Trump went into office. The attorney from Stanford, Burns, he was telling me that he was giving about 2 talks a week. Last I spoke with him a couple weeks ago, he said he was, things were slowing down a bit, but even he told me that week itself, he had 2 lined up already. So that's how that goes there. But I would say they're still definitely holding steady, if not ramping up at this point.
And can you tell me, this is like specific to trainings, can you tell me about the concept of a red card? What is that and why is that important part of the process?
Yeah, so the red cards are often a very key component of the training process because they can help you with communicating for an officer. So the best way to think about it is like a business card. If your business card has all your contact information on it, your red card's gonna have all your relevant constitutional rights listed. So they're like a tool for people who may have trouble verbally stating, like, I do not consent to a search or I do not wish to speak to you. And that can be because either they don't speak English very well or they're just like so frightened that they get frozen, right? So at the very least, this can be used as like a last ditch effort of like, I can't really say anything right now, but here's a card. It also can be used as evidence for your defense if you do end up in front of a deportation judge and you've given out all your other red cards. You can save the last one and hand it to the deportation judge. This was used while I was being detained and they violated my rights, and so hopefully that will show the judge that your rights were violated at the time.
And so we've been talking a lot about, too, that these training workshops are focused for the undocumented or immigrant communities. But who else can benefit from this information? Because I imagine if you're a bystander or a neighbor, perhaps there are moments where you can step in.
Well, that's exactly what advocates and immigration attorneys are saying, that these trainings are for everybody so that there is a like almost net of safety for your undocumented neighbors and friends. So, for example, something that you teach at these trainings is that you can record an interaction with an ICE officer. But if you're the one who's detained, your phone is most likely going to be taken away. So if that neighbor or loved one managed to catch the recording of that interaction, they can offer that video for you for your address when you go see a deportation judge and use that as evidence.
And so if any listeners out there are interested in learning more about these resources or kind of going back to the whole, there's so much information there, it's a little overwhelming, where would you point them?
Yeah, well, as you kept saying, ctpublic.org is a great place to go. Look up Where We Live, or you can also search my name, Daniela Doncel. I've written articles about this, and all of those articles have links embedded in there. We at Connecticut Public are actually working on an immigrant resource guide so that kind of all this information is in one place. It's almost like a one-stop shop type of situation. So that'll be available at some point in the near future. But I would also recommend actually searching up these organizations that are in your local area, because these organizations are typically best equipped to help the people in their immediate area. So a quick search of any legal aid centers or advocacy groups in your area is going to be the best help you can find.
You've been listening to Daniela Doncel, who's our Latino communities reporter here at Connecticut Public. You can follow Danny's work on ctpublic.org. Danny, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
You can also join the conversation, listeners. Let us know if you have any questions, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Notario Fraud. It sounds official, but as it turns out, it's anything but. This scam targets immigrants by offering legal help from people who aren't actually lawyers. Joining me to explain how it works, Catherine Blinder, who's the Chief Education and Outreach Officer for Connecticut's Department of Consumer Protection. Catherine, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for covering this subject.
And so before we talk about Notario Fraud, Catherine specifically, can you remind us what the State Department of Consumer Protection does? What role does the department play in keeping Connecticut residents safe?
We license, regulate, assist a wide range of services and businesses. When I speak publicly, I always say that we touch everyone's lives in some way, and it's true. We regulate everything from legal gambling to skilled trades to well drillers. So that is what we do. But our primary focus and the way that we feel we can protect consumers the best is through education, so that people know when they are wronged and they can make good decisions for themselves.
And your office has been dealing with the notarial scam for many years now. Can you share with us what exactly is it and who is being targeted?
So, when I was hired 11 years ago, our then commissioner told me that his priority was to stop notario fraud. I had never heard of it 11 years ago. But a lot of us who work in this field have now. So what we did was try to reach out to underserved communities, to communities of non-English speaking people, to try to educate them. A lot of people who come from countries in Central and South America, a notario is a lawyer. That is what they are called. So when they see a sign on a storefront that says notario, they trust that person to follow through correctly on their immigration search. These are people who want to live in this country. They are choosing us because we have been the beacon of freedom. And then often what happens in these cases is that sadly someone from their own community, because they speak the language and they know the customs, prey on them and take advantage of them. So the first thing they do is they hire a little storefront. They put a notario sign on. They ask you to pay in cash. And they ask you always to pay. I've heard of $5,000, but usually it's $500. And then they offer to fill out the forms for you, which is not legal. You have to fill out any immigration forms. They also charge you for the forms, which are all free, and they will not keep you informed as to what the progress of your case is. So, and the other thing they do is they will give you their card and they will encourage you only to call them for information, not to call UCIS.
Well, and I mentioned previously, too, that this fraud isn't something new. It's been around for a while. But is there anything about what you're seeing today versus prior that sets maybe this moment apart?
Fear and desperation. People are both desperate. People who have been here for 20 years are desperate to become citizens, and not just because they will be protected, but because they came here to become citizens, to be part of America. And I think that what's happened is that desperation has collided with a sense of fear for immigrants in the country right now. And it's just opened up this watershed of people taking advantage of them.
Well, I know you mentioned that oftentimes this is a storefront with the word notario in the front. Are there other ways that this scam can look like in practice? Can it be a phone call or a letter or a text? We know texting is a very it's a place to start for many of these scams.
Yeah. And because almost everyone has a phone now.
Right.
The texting, it's fairly new. I've just heard about it in the last couple of years. But the text that I have seen that people have showed me just says, are you tired of waiting to become an American citizen? And so they guarantee a speedy process. And there is not a speedy process. My daughter-in-law, who's Mexican, worked for 3 years to just get a green card. Mm-hmm. She got it last week, and we're very happy.
Oh, congratulations.
But it was 3 years, and it's a massive amount of paperwork and evidence. And a lot of these folks are not sophisticated in the legal process. Right. I've seen community organizations who struggle with just teaching people how to make a copy of something. So the text, phones, also they will go to churches. They'll advertise in church bulletins. People almost always trust their church. They'll put advertisements up outside of schools so that people who come to pick their kids up will see them. They'll put them up in laundromats, places where they know people in the community frequent.
And do we know anything about how widespread this fraud is, both in Connecticut specifically and nationally?
So it's really, really hard to track because
Right.
people are not willing to complain. But the FTC estimates, based on their caseload, that 1 in 5 immigrants who are trying to gain citizenship are victims of notario fraud.
And sort of with this idea that, or the experiences that you shared with us and building this picture, what would you recommend people who are targeted by this scam do? You know, when they do get that text or when they see that storefront, are there things that they can look out for? And if they have an inkling of questioning, can they contact the State Department of Consumer Protection?
So what they should watch out for is, and it's hard because people are also trusting in addition to be desperate, but make sure that you talk to your friends and family and get recommendations. Often in a small community, I know a few years ago in the Peruvian community, there was a notario who basically was run out of town by Peruvian community leaders. So there is enforcement within the community, but make sure they're an immigration lawyer and a real immigration lawyer. I know Sheila will talk some about that, or an OLAP approved provider. And what that is the Office of Legal Access Protection will authorize and train people, usually who work out of libraries. Hartford Public Library has several who can do that. Never pay for forms. They are all free. Never let someone fill anything out for you because that will immediately stop the process. You can be helped with language or meaning, but you have to sign that paperwork. Never pay cash. A real immigration lawyer is not going to ask you to pay cash up front. And keep a file of all of your paperwork, not just for your use, but also as evidence in case you should need it, that you did provide those things. Stay on top of your case online. See that it's moving forward. If it's not moving forward, you've been ripped off. There's no way to recover your money. And often I've seen people were deported because their paperwork was filled out incorrectly. We can't, unfortunately, do a lot around this. Our primary job right now is trying to get out to as many communities as possible and let them know it exists. The FBI in Connecticut has actually been really, really good about following up these cases. And the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, also, while you can, you could file with them.
Well, then we've gone through a lot of information for people who are listening. Is there anything else that you would like to leave with our listeners today? What do you hope they take away from this conversation?
What I hope is that they still would like to be Americans, that they still would like to live in this country, and that there are legal processes that enable them to do that. We see, in some Muslim communities, women feel reluctant to take the lead on this, and men are afraid. So I think working with all of those community organizations that were just listed by your previous guest, they can help people. They're culturally aware. They have access to language translation. And I think reach out to them.
You've been listening to Catherine Blinder, who's the Chief Education Outreach Officer for Connecticut's Department of Consumer Protection. Catherine, thank you so much for sharing all of these insights with our listeners today.
Thank you, Catherine, very much.
And now I'm joined by Sheila Hare. Sheila is a clinical professor of law at Quinnipiac University. Sheila, welcome back to Where We Live.
Great to hear from you, Catherine. Thanks for focusing on this issue.
And so, Sheila, you have been listening to the conversation I had just had with Catherine. Do you have any thoughts on what you just heard? Anything that jumped out to you?
Well, yeah, I loved hearing all of the information that Catherine shared, simply because it's what I experience every day with my clients. Only yesterday, I spoke to someone who said, Sheila, can you help me apply for legal permanent residence? She had gotten asylum, and she said she was working with a tax preparer who promised that he could also do her immigration paperwork, but that it would cost a lot of money. And, again, she didn't want to reach out and bother me, but these are the kind of stories you hear. And this sort of one-stop shopping is a very common sign of a notario who basically is not licensed to practice law and is essentially saying, I can help you with everything if you pay me a lot of money. And the real tragedy, honestly, I tell my clients, is if they take your money and they don't do anything. But the real tragedy happens when they take your money and then they file paperwork. Because if you file paperwork incorrectly, if there's any kind of misrepresentation on it, or if you're filing paperwork for something you're not eligible for, it can actually put people on the radar screen of immigration. So they face deportation. They could even face fraud charges because they have no idea what this preparer put on their paperwork. And essentially, this fraud goes undeterred because the people are no longer around. Many of them have been deported or they're hiding in the shadows because they're so afraid of the system. So that's why I think this fraud is so pervasive.
Well, and Catherine had mentioned it earlier too, sort of echoing what you just said here in terms of seeing this fraud happening over the last decade. Let's say, it has been happening, but the role that fear and tension is playing with these scams that are happening today is a lot more, I think, fraught than years before. Can you talk about whether or not you've seen a surge in the notarial frauds compared to maybe previous years in your own experience? And also, what are some other factors that make undocumented immigrants especially vulnerable to scams like this?
Yeah, I would say it's hard to see if I've seen a surge. Again, most people sort of hide in the shadows and are afraid to admit that they've been cheated. And I think many of them are from different countries, so they're afraid of the system and they don't want to report it. But my sense is there is absolutely an increase. I'm even seeing with U.S. citizens, I think your previous participant, Catherine, was saying that it's fear and desperation. And I'm even getting calls from U.S. citizens who are saying they're afraid to travel, or they have spouses who are legal permanent residents. They're afraid to travel. And so that is just exponentially greater among the undocumented community. So people are afraid that if they come into contact with the immigration deportation machine, that they will be, honestly, in the worst situations that I've seen, separated from their children. And I think this hopelessness really leads people to reach out to any hope that they have of becoming legal. Again, I have folks, as your previous caller suggested, who've been in this country for over 25 years, and they say they have never been more afraid. And I would just point out that in Connecticut, so many of these undocumented people, more than half have lived here for over 10 years, and over 30% have lived here for 15 years or more. And these are people, again, that are reporting for the first time ever. They've never felt more fear than ever before.
Well, and really with what you just shared now, many people, including citizens and non-citizens, are sharing that fear, are expressing that fear to you. And like you touched on before, part of the problem is that scammers aren't always using empty threats, right? Have we seen instances where they do share a person's legal status and personal information with authorities if they don't comply?
Yeah, honestly, I have not seen that as much because my experience is that people are actually afraid to report this. What shocks my law students when I'm teaching is I say, I've seen cases, and it's not just notarios, it's actually shady lawyers as well that we see often doing this just to get people's money. They're not very familiar with immigration law, and they're just cutting corners. I tell my students, I've seen folks confiscate clients' passports and refuse to give them back, which is, basic violation of the law. And when you talk to these folks, you say, look, you can speak up, you can file a grievance against them. You can take action. This is against the law. And they say, no, I'm too afraid because I'm undocumented. And they are threatening me with adverse immigration consequences, with deportation if I come forward. So to be honest, that's the story I hear the most, is people who have clear cases of fraud or abuse and misrepresentation against them, and they're just simply too afraid to come forward and speak out.
So for those who might be able to speak out or have someone fight for them, do you see any terms of recourse when someone falls victim to a scam like Notario? It sounds like it's pretty typical that folks are not given their money back or anything really, but have you seen any sort of consequences?
Well, again, I think, if folks are willing to come forward, there is opportunity to ask immigration to reopen the case or to reconsider. There's opportunities to appeal. I mean, one of the things I think that Senator Murphy, our senator,
Mm-hmm.
is proposing is this Strengthening Immigration Procedures Act. Currently, in immigration, you actually first have to file a grievance, a bar complaint against your lawyer in order to appeal your case. And this is something that I think immigration advocates across the board have said really slow down the process and really are incredible disincentives for people to, bring forward their case and ask for a redress when mistakes have been made. So I think that's one area that is very hopeful because, again, people are very hesitant to come forward. When I see hope, it's when there are multiple folks who have been defrauded, unfortunately. I mean, I know that sounds crazy to say that's a bright spot, but it gives people hope to come forward as a group when they all have the same sort of claim. But again, those are few and far between. I mean, the other thing that we're looking at as advocates, just more generally, is expanding the Trust Act. It's House Bill 7212, and essentially it would try to sort of prevent folks from going further into the shadows right now and limit the ability of law enforcement and other state officials to be forcibly deputized by the states to participate in deportation. It was also limit information sharing. I think in this age where we're seeing threats of using information at the IRS, tax information, immigration information at the Department of Motor Vehicles, information from the Department of Social Services. I mean, these are, again, movements or threats, whether they're just simply threats or whether they actually become a reality. They have a tremendous chilling effect. And I think it's important to act broadly to think about how do we make sure that our immigrant communities are not living in fear and that when there's harm done to them, and the harm is not just immigration fraud, it's crimes, it's domestic violence, it's abuse, it's trafficking, how to encourage these folks to come forward and not live in the shadows when they've been victimized.
Well, I know you gave us a picture of there's a lot of support systems here, but it's also, as we kind of talked about in the earlier segment, of needing to know where to get help or to ask these questions. Is it safe to come forward even if you are undocumented? As we talked about the hesitancy, and I think many of us can understand why. But is it safe to come forward?
Well, again, I liked what your reporter Daniela said. I think
Mm-hmm.
we try to emphasize that there are local nonprofits working in the community, work with people you trust, and really ask your communities, ask your neighbors, and do your due diligence. But I think to the extent that folks are working with important nonprofits like Make the Road, Greater Hartford, New Haven Legal Assistance, Iris, a lot of the organizations that she mentioned, I think when you work with those folks, they can put people in touch with lawyers who can accurately advise them and assess the risk. Because I agree with you, that is an important question. And if you're not asking that, I think all undocumented people have to weigh the risks against the benefits. And unfortunately, in some cases, I find myself saying to somebody, you're right, you've been victimized, you've been a victim of a crime, but the danger of going to court and speaking out may indeed be too great. And that's something that you actually have to weigh. I love that she had talked about some of these Know Your Rights presentations. And one of the things that really sticks out, I love that she was mentioning there's some there's actually practice and role playing.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that struck with me, there was a lawyer that was testifying on behalf of the Trust Act, and he described being in a parking lot after taking his client to court and being surrounded by, ICE vehicles, 4 vehicles, and the people in masks. They asked his client to get out of the car. And what was really interesting is one of the things we do when we do Know Your Rights training is we always say, ask if they have a warrant. And he said, when he testified before the legislature, I asked for whether they had a warrant. They said yes. And he commented that I then forgot to ask to see it. Right. And so that's why it's so important to do this role playing. And it's so much easier said than done, I think, to know your rights, but to really have people be calm in the circumstance and not give in. Again, enforce your rights and make sure you're sort of role playing and pushing your ability to push back to the fullest extent.
Right. And just a quick follow-up for our listeners that all that information on organizations and groups will be available on ctpublic.org/where we live. Or if you look up our community, Latino communities reporter, Daniela Doncel, you can search for her stories also on ctpublic.org. You've been listening to Sheila Hare, who's the clinical professor of law at Quinnipiac University. And Sheila will stay with us after the break. And listeners, let us know if you've been a target of a scam or if you have any questions. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Still with me is Sheila Hare, clinical professor of law at Quinnipiac University. And this hour, we're taking a look at scam targeting immigrants and undocumented people across Connecticut, the Notario Fraud. And let us know if you have any questions about the scams and how to spot them. 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Sheila, I know earlier we talked a little bit about how to look out for these scams or how to safeguard yourselves from Catherine, who's with the State Department of Consumer Protection. Do you have any tips, Sheila, to share on how someone should go about verifying that they're being contacted by an actual legitimate attorney?
Absolutely. And, we include this in so many of our client letters when we close a file. I really wanted to highlight what Catherine said about folks who speak the same language and say, trust me, I'm your brother. I've heard that a lot. from the same community. And they use that cultural currency to get trust and faith. And a lot of times we hear folks saying, hey, I know someone in immigration, I can help you get in line early. We often tell people, if you're not seeing it plastered all over the newspapers that there's some type of opportunity to apply for legal immigration status, it's probably not true. Again, we hear things like, I know someone in immigration. And it's interesting because I think as Americans or people who have lived here for a long time, these seem kind of easy to sort of spot. But if you consider that these folks come from different countries where the systems, the criminal justice systems, the legal systems work very differently, you realize that it's not completely out of the ordinary to hear some of these things. And, I just wanted to highlight what's really remarkable to me, and it really highlights for how long Notario fraud has been going on. Mm-hmm. I have had a number of students say the reason they have come to law school was because their parents were victims of Notario fraud. And as children, they watched their parents spent years fighting their cases in court, trying to fix the fraud and the problems created by these notarios in order to get eventually legal status. And many of them have ended up deported. So again, I just see the ones for whom often the case came out positively, but again, inspired students to sort of come back into the law and reach out to communities and try to increase knowledge about what happens with notarios. And it's that desperation, as they say, our parents simply wanted to get legal status in this country and had been here for over a decade and, just didn't know better. And when someone told them, look, you have a U.S. citizen child, that child can sponsor you, it sounds real. Mm-hmm. But for those of us who know the complexities of immigration law, we know that's one of the biggest myths that Americans believe. That is, if you have a U.S. citizen child, you can get legal status to that child. That is absolutely not true. And most of the cases that I see with people coming into my office. So this is why it's an area ripe for abuse. It's a complicated system.
Well, we've been talking a lot about vulnerabilities, and you mentioned earlier that Connecticut's Trust Act as a way to shield against some of the vulnerabilities that we've been discussing here. Can you describe what the Trust Act is, and do you see this as something that would help Connecticut's immigrant and undocumented community?
I absolutely think that this is a really important move, especially right now. I think people feel terrified in Connecticut, and this act would limit the ability, again, of state officials, and it expands the definitions of state officials to include things like school police officers from cooperating with ICE absent legal justification, a proper, for example, judicial warrant. And it also limits information sharing. And I can't tell you how important I think this is, because we're seeing across the state people no longer going to schools, church, reaching out to social services, schools, and court. I think court is one of the ones that really worries me. And so, especially in an era when law enforcement has really emphasized the need to have trust with the undocumented community in order to fight crime. The extent to which undocumented folks aren't reaching out to the police and are going to their court hearings, I think this should be alarming to all of us, even those of us who are not undocumented, right? Because in my experience working with victims of crimes, I have seen time and time again that you have someone who is victimizing someone who's undocumented, and lo and behold, you turn around and you realize there's a slew of other criminal activities that affect our communities. So even if you're someone who's not concerned in particular about the undocumented community, this is something we as citizens of Connecticut should be concerned about. That is, having people feel comfortable coming to court, going to the police to report crimes and to bring some of these problems to light so that we're all safer.
And really quickly here, because we mentioned other crimes too, on top of the Notario Fraud, your office also deals with trafficking a lot. Do you find that public awareness is lacking there? Maybe a little bit similar to the Notario Fraud that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. I mean, again, most of the client population I deal with, but the issue is the vulnerabilities that are used against them to keep them in the shadows. And we absolutely see this being true of trafficking victims. I mean, one of the areas that we like to focus on is amending the criminal justice system so that it is able to better consider and create more opportunities for these folks in the shadows to come forward. And right now, the Senate Bill 1502, the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, would allow survivors of trafficking and sexual assault, in addition to domestic violence victims, to ask the court to consider their victimization, the fact that they were a victim of trafficking, for example, when they are being sentenced. And to us, this is really important because I think there are actors in the criminal justice system that already take this into consideration. But I have to say, I personally have seen across the state areas where this is not being taken into consideration. And frankly, the biggest problem, as we've highlighted today, is the willingness of these folks to come forward because of these vulnerabilities. And with acts like this, it opens up more space and moments for these folks to come forward and explain, hey, this is why I might have this charge against me. It was because I am a victim of, for example, trafficking or sexual assault or domestic violence.
So got less than a minute here, Sheila, but before we wrap up, would love to ask some final thoughts on, why what we've been talking about matters, and why does it matter even for those who do enjoy the privilege of their citizen status?
Well, again, what I'm seeing, and it worries me a lot, is two big concerns. That is that a lot of these families are mixed status families, as explained by your reporter, Daniela. And so we have kids who are U.S. citizens, and they literally are in their homes living in terror that they're going to be separated from their parents. And I think the other thing is, as we see our communities erode because of these increased enforcement efforts, and I would call it, deportation dragnet, I think we see the fear, frankly, I'm shocked, seep into all of our lives. And I think when we start to erode due process protections in these areas, we as U.S. citizens, I think, are affected. And this is what I've seen when I get calls every day from U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents.
You've been listening to Sheila Hare, clinical professor of law at Quinnipiac University. Sheila also supervises students in Quinnipiac's Civil Justice Clinic. Sheila, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And listeners, we'll link the resources we've been discussing on today's show on our website. Check them out at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Chloe Wynn. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.